as was said, I've been thinking about precision multi-domain battle probably about 5 years now, publishing a few things on it, one of them over there. And then, it's become one of my areas of research interest, along with a few others. And what has attracted to me this is that I believe that the problem of long-range precision fires is the single most important question facing contemporary military forces in how to maneuver and fight in the face of these weapons, in the face of what is now commonly called anti-access and area denial technologies. And that's because fire and maneuver is like the foundation of what you do. Yeah? And has been really since, for about 200 years. And this is also not the first time that there's been an impediment to the ability of military forces to fire and maneuver. So, while not new, it is a bit different. So when the first time this occurred, I would date to around 1864. And if you've ever been to Virginia and done some battlefield study tours there, I would strongly suggest you go to Spotsylvania Courthouse. And there you'll see the lines of the Confederates and the lines of the Union forces separated by several hundred meters. And they look like the Western Front of France. It's because in the face of the fire that these weapons could put out, soldiers had to dig into the earth to survive. And when they did have to assault, they had to maneuver across a fire-swept zone, beaten with lead, which was lethal. And how they had to figure out how to do that. And that's because from the middle of the 19th century all the way up to the First World War, a series of new weapons technologies emerged, or advancements in existing ones, that allowed the defender to put out more and more fire, increase the depth of the beaten zone to greater and greater depths. And these all should be familiar with you because some of them you're still using today, such as machine guns, right? Rifles, quick-firing artillery, smokeless powder, all those kinds of things come into existence and, through industrialization, achieve wide distribution across all armies around the globe. And the generals, commanders of the time, understood what was happening. They could see these technologies, these weapons, and they drew the correct implications from it, that it was going to become increasingly harder to close with the enemy and achieve that decisive action of being able to force the enemy out of their positions and engage with them. That last maneuver that the infantry do, close up, get close with their opponents. So they knew what was happening, and they thought about it. And they never solved it. And as a result of that, we have the First World War with the Western Front, with that stalemate of two trench lines, sides looking at each other over several hundred yards, meters, unless you were in Gallipoli, and there the distance might be only 20 meters, but separated by a beaten zone of lethal fire. And eventually they figure it out, and they're able to restore maneuver in the war's final months. So this is the challenge that contemporary commanders, generals, admirals, air marshals are facing, is to how to continue to fight and close with the enemy under conditions of today's precision weapons. And I say there's even another question here. Is it even possible? I'm not sure yet. I still have to think, still thinking about this. But are we at really a fundamental transition point that this technology is driving that something very different is happening in the art of war? I don't know. I'm just speculating. But there is a new no man's land appearing. But it's different from the one from 1914 to 1918. That's because today's no man's land, from some of the technologies that are available, could be 2,000 kilometers, not 200 meters. And with modern sensor technology, the adversary, the enemy, can spot you at these kinds of ranges and bring very accurate and lethal fire to bear upon you. And this is extending out not just over land, such as was the case in the First World War, but over into the sea and into the air. And so the maritime domain is becoming equally vulnerable, if not even more vulnerable, than on the land. And the ability of the land to dominate the sea is increasing. Very unusual situation. And it might become possible in the not too distant future for the land to actually control the sea in the way ships used to do. And when that happens, I'm not sure what that means for fleets. And this new no man's land, we also have to think non-kinetically. Because when you add in the capabilities of cyber as a weapon and social media as a weapon, we're no longer talking about a theater-size no man's land, we're talking about a global no man's land. I suspect will become the main target, and the soldiers, or the military, quite secondary. But this new no man's land remains untested. But I think we have to take it very seriously as this new era dawns. So what we're going to be doing here is talking about one of the potential solutions. As I said, contemporary generals, admirals are thinking hard about this, and a solution has been proposed, and that is multi-domain battle. And I'm going to do is explain what multi-domain battle is, although hopefully for this audience I don't have to explain it very deeply. And then I'm going to explain why it's destined to fail, and why, yes, a first effort, good beginning, but also one that we need to adjust quickly because we're heading down a very dangerous path, or at least I should say the United States is. But often Australia tends to follow. And it certainly has implications for the Australian Army, the ADF, and Australian society. But it is commendable that this is a deliberate effort to solve this problem of anti-access. So the U.S. Army put out a concept paper in December of last year. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it is available online. It's an open source document called Multi-Domain Battle, Evolution of Combined Arms Warfare, or Evolution of Combined Arms for the 21st Century. And I'll just quote what it says multi-domain battle is. So, quote, convergence of capabilities to create windows of advantage, often temporary, across multiple domains and contested areas throughout the depth of the battle space to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative, defeat enemies, and achieve military objectives. Now, that paragraph and the rest of the document is written in this style of language that only the military can aspire to. And it is difficult to read. But what they are trying to say is that, and why they're doing this, is that there is recognition in the U.S. that potential adversaries have adapted to the U.S. way of war and the advantages that the U.S. once had. And these are advantages that Australia piggybacks on, and Britain. And that these advantages that once existed no longer available, or they're waning quickly. The U.S. no longer enjoys uncontested superiority in some or all domains. Now, I'm not convinced they ever had uncontested superiority in any of them, but that's what they're saying. And that means, what they mean by that is potential adversaries have or potentially will achieve symmetry with the U.S. way of war. And in doing so, prevent the U.S. from achieving the kinds of victories that it wishes to achieve, which, the 2003 crushing of Iraq during the invasion of Iraq, that's the hallmark, that's the template of what they want. They also are afraid that they're losing the ability or the freedom of action in the land, air, sea, space, and cyber domains. And they want to restore that ability to project military power globally. So the U.S., on the map of the world, doesn't want any off-limits areas. If it wants to intervene, it has that ability. It may not want to, or may not decide that it's not wise to do that, but at least wants the ability or the posturing that they could do it if they so wished. And these potential adversaries If you read the security statement from General Secretary of Defense Mattis, came out a couple of weeks ago, it's quite clear who they're thinking about, and that's China and Russia in the first ranks, quickly followed by Iran and North Korea, and then there might be some lesser states there too. So how is the U.S. going to be able to use multi-domain battle to project its force anywhere in the world? And what they would like to do is be able to have a rapid campaign of maneuver across all areas of the expanded battle space, not just on the land, but also in cyber, in space, air, and sea. And to do so simultaneously, and to achieve effects in these domains simultaneously, not necessarily by air and air, but why not cyber achieving effect in air, and air achieving effect in cyber. So breaking down those barriers between the domains. And the result is a quick decision. The theory is that by doing this and operating so rapidly simultaneously in all these domains, it'll present the enemy with multiple dilemmas. And through this network force, exploit windows of advantage, or open windows of advantage, faster than the enemy can react. So those of you who have been studied air power theory would know about Boyd and the OODA loop thing. So this is like a theater level OODA loop, where the US acts more quickly than the enemy can react. And as the enemy falls behind in the reaction space, okay, gaps in their defenses will open, which the US will then act in. Now, I think it's a great theory. And it's certainly a step in the right direction. But I also think it's a highly dangerous concept. I'll even go so far as potentially catastrophic. And I think it's not going to work. And I think it's important to explain why, because it is going to have effects on the ADF and the NATO allies. So we're all sort of buying into it as the US develops it. I'll give a number of reasons. First one is all major transitions in the past have been accompanied by a challenge to the existing culture. Somebody gets nervous. Some vested interest pushes back. And I'll give you one example here is that in 1939, the US Chief of Cavalry refused to allow his horse units, mounted horse units, to be mechanized. Now, this is 39. If you're still pushing horses in 39, you've got a cultural bias there. Next year, his department is dissolved. But there are other instances where this happened. In the interwar period, you have carrier admirals versus battleship admirals. So it's nothing unusual. But if multi-domain battle is a major advancement in how the US fights, there should be some pushback. And I realize that I'm examining this from 10,000 miles, from a distance. And my observations of the inner workings of the US military is limited, but so far I've seen no pushback. Now I understand that this has been initiated by General Milley and picked up by General Perkins and General Brown, so that's a whole bevy of 4-stars pushing it. And generally when 4-stars want something, they usually get it, and being soldiers, everybody falls into line behind them. At least they do that to their faces, up front, but behind the scenes, usually there's somebody working saying, my special interest is going to be changed here, challenged. And I know, because I've spent my entire year in my entire career in the cavalry that this can't be allowed to happen. There's nothing. No sign of any cultural. And that makes me very uncomfortable, because it suggests to me that this isn't very revolutionary, that this isn't very much pushing the window, the envelope here, and what they're ending up with is just a slight tweak to the existing way of doing business. And so I thought about what is the existing way of doing business. And it came to me that the US now is a believer in sharp, fast, decisive war, just like Prussia was in Europe from the age of Frederick the Great all the way through the Wehrmacht experiences of the Second World War. Germany, because of its, and Prussia, because of its location in Central Europe with no natural boundaries, surrounded by potentially hostile and sometimes stronger states, believed it had to win fast and furiously, decisively, before the enemy could overwhelm them. But the United States is not Prussia. But there is a point of commonality here. The U.S., through professionalization of the force, has become a relatively small organization, small compared to its demands put upon it, without access, as it had in the past, to the full resource base of the nation. The generals believe that they have to fight with the existing force as it is, and they have to have a short war. Because if they don't have a short war, then they'll have to turn to the nation, and they're not quite convinced how the nation will react, because the soldiers have been cut off. Now, I realize this is some cultural nuances here, and of course you're also a professional force, and is that also happening here? I don't have an answer to that, so I'm just putting it out there. But while coming up with a concept of fighting that aligns with your cultural desires could be perhaps a sensible thing, I'm not sure it is, but could be, the whole multi-domain battle does lack internal logic. Because if you're identifying your opponents as peer competitors, China and Russia, and you're then determining to fight a quick, decisive battle with a peer competitor, well, that is a very unusual outcome. So as I think back in the past as a military historian I can only find a very rare instances where wars between peers end quickly. An example is the 1866 war between Prussia and Austria. Most wars between peers are long, painful, attritional, which is exactly the thing the United States Army wants to avoid. So they seem to be designing a concept for war that is most likely going to result in the exact opposite of what they believe they need. So that's why it has a lack of an internal logic. It's also working towards a tactical solution to what is essentially a theater-level problem, and perhaps even a global problem. And multi-domain is also incredibly complex. It has multiple moving parts that need to be coordinated through various network communications. Those of you, I work with people who are developing the Army, developing the Australian Army into a digital force. It's been going on for about 10 years. It's going to take another 20 years. Right? It's incredibly complex, it seems. I don't quite understand what makes it quite complex, but it is, they tell me. So, with the U.S., and I'm sure there'll be redundancy of channels, and they'll, harden it and all that. But it reminds me of the transformation RMA of the 1990s, where the Pentagon said, through sensors and battlespace awareness, we're going to lift the fog of war. Something that nobody's ever been able to do in the past. Well, we soon learned that the fog is as dense as it's ever been, and will most likely remain as dense as it's ever been. But multi-domain battle promises not only the lifting of the fog of war, but for everything to be coordinated across these 5 domains so simultaneously and faster than your opponent is also going to eliminate friction, the other Clausewitzian concept, which has accompanied war since humanity's beginning. So anything that says or promises to lift both fog and friction gets me a little concerned that they're being a little too hopeful. I don't, doesn't mean it won't work, doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to pull it off, but the effort required might prove too much. But my largest objection to or my belief of what's wrong with multi-domain battle is I believe that there's a lack of connection with strategy. Now, down in Canberra, the cells next door to where my office is are with concept people. And when I raise this with them, the concept people tell me, we do concepts, we don't do strategy. We can write concepts, and we don't have to worry about strategy. That's somebody else's department. But I think that's not quite a good plan. Because concepts have to be set within a national strategy. Otherwise, how can they possibly work? Yeah? You can't just decide, as multi-domain battle does, that we're going to focus on the battle and achieve an outcome of a battle without knowing what that battle is attempting, is hoping to achieve in the political sense, in the political world. Okay? You need to ask the question, what does it mean to achieve other than just simply victory? And it fails to recognize, from a strategic point of view, that the US is actually the status quo power, particularly in the Western Pacific, well, even in Western Europe, with the help of NATO allies. So as the status quo power, the United States actually has quite an easy task compared to a rising or challenging power, because the United States doesn't have to go forward and project power into the other enemy person's territory to gain the influence it wants. It just has to prevent the other person from doing that. And in fact, I would suggest that an A2AD strategy for the United States would be a very powerful means to contain its potential rivals. But the United States has shown, at least the US Army has shown, that they're not interested in a defensive kind of strategy, because that would be a long, prolonged effort. And they want a fast victory. And I think another to me, very obvious flaw in the multi-domain battle concept, and it's one that is shared or was shared by the air-sea battle concept of a few years ago, is that, let's just say, and we're not going to say China is the adversary, but some big country in the eastern, Western Pacific, gets into a stoush with the United States, and the United States manages to drive its carrier groups across the Pacific into the Western Pacific until it's in the littoral of this this hostile state. This concept, that's what it attempts to do. That's what it's being designed to do. But it doesn't ask the question, okay, we're now off the shore. What do we do next? It has no answer for that. It reminds me of that sort of joke or story about the dog chasing the car. Usually the dog doesn't get the car, but if the dog ever does grab onto that bumper and discovers that he has his mouth embedded into a seal, the dog then does, what the hell did I do? What do I do now? And the US doesn't have an answer for that, or doesn't, at least in this concept, doesn't have an answer. And I don't know how many news the carrier group might have with them, but I'm pretty sure the Chinese, if it is the Chinese, have a lot more troops ashore. Now, I said this could potentially be catastrophic, even for Australia. Because there seems to be no recognition in the US at the moment that attempting to wage a decisive war with a peer competitor who is nuclear armed is a bad idea. The concept does mention nuclear weapons, but it just says we have to prevent escalation. But I would suggest that if you manage to go to war with a nuclear armed competitor and gain a decisive advantage, if you're pressing down on their throat with your boot, in their final throws of the dice, your opponent will decide, well, the last option we have is nuclear. And they will use them. And then escalation is inevitable, which will be catastrophic, not just for the United States and a place like China. A full-scale nuclear exchange will be bad for all of us. In a sense, it will be the ending of the human race. And it's like those people who are thinking about multi-domain battle at the moment have no memory of the Cold War. Now, history is a very fleeting thing, and people forget it very quickly. But during the Cold War, the best anybody could come up with nuclear weapons was, deterrence, because we have mutually assured destruction. If anybody uses them, we all die. So you can't use them, but you can use them for deterrence, and it works. But when you start talking about having a conventional war and at least not even recognizing the potential for escalation, then we should all be very, very concerned. But there's also within that multi-domain battle another form of catastrophe that is not as spectacular as nuclear annihilation, but just as real. I mean, the US has been using its power to become an increasingly bellicose state, intervening wherever it chooses. Now, I remember a time, when it just did that in South America, and nobody really concerned too much how many times it intervened in Nicaragua, which I think was 4, or the Dominican Republic, which I think was 5. These were all minor states, in a backwater part of the world, so the US was willing to, say, it's ours. But since then, the US has been intervening in places that really are remote, and I'm not sure are really that core to its interests. The US wasn't always like this. But to do so, it's clear that the US is draining of its wealth. Now, a few years ago, Stiglitz, the economist, published a book called The $3 Trillion War. I think it was in 2008. And at the time, people objected to that, saying, oh, it's not $3 trillion, that we haven't spent $3 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. And frankly, nobody knows how much money has been spent in either of those places. I would say even Australia doesn't know how much Australia has spent in those places. It all depends on what numbers you count and what numbers you ignore. At the Brown University, there's a Center for the Cost of War, and they crunch numbers up all the time. And in 2016, they were up to $4.7 billion for the wars, 4.7 trillion for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even if that number is wrong, it's still a lot of money. Money that could be spent to develop national wealth. Because ultimately, war, the ability to wage war, the ability to deter, is a function of national wealth. And that US national wealth, while not declining in absolute terms, is declining in relative terms. Plus, we're no longer really in the Cold War, no matter how fond some people might remember it. And there are other matters, such as terrorism, climate change, risk of deglobalization, spreading instability, that may become more significant in the future than they were in the past. And multi-domain battle has nothing in it to deal with any of these. It is solely for peer competitors. So, having thoroughly trashed multi-domain battle, what can I say about a way forward? Well, one of the things we like to say at the Australian Army Research Center is that we're the people who raise the questions. We don't come up with that. We don't come up with answers. Somebody else is. That's the guys down the hall. But I can suggest a few things. And like one of the indications of history is that periodically you have to reinvent the wheel. And my first book actually deals with that on seeking victory on the Western Front. And essentially, the weapons that were used to create the no man's land become the weapons that you used to unlock no man's land. But the solution requires mass and time. It also still involves the expenditure of lives. So it's not cheap, it's not fast. But even before the US can get there to solve this power projection problem, there has to be a realization within the United States that this tactical problem is really a theater problem, set within a context of strategic void. That there's only one theater now, and it's global. So as a way forward, I mean, I still like multi-domain battle. You might find that hard to believe, but it's true. Because it is that first step on what I hope is a journey. But that direction needs to shift that they're going in. And the aperture of thinking needs to widen. They actually need to get out of their cultural comfort zone. The US has to be made to, the people who are driving these new ideas have to come up with ideas that make the organization uncomfortable if they're going to find the means to overcome the challenge of no man's land. There are some possibilities out there, such as the opportunities of the potential fourth industrial age, which is now just emerging or starting to unwind. Things in artificial intelligence, things in the connectivity of the world. I'm not entirely sure, but these are possibilities. But I think at the moment, the safest course of action is similar to what was done during the Cold War. It's to prevent war between peers, not to encourage it. I think the way to do this is to take advantage of things like cyber, things like social media. Excuse me. And instead of making the focus of the phases of war 0 to 4, and 0 being when you're on the way to war, we actually need something else. And something which I've been tentatively playing with, calling phase 00. So that is because war is not about battle, but it's about politics, right? We should all know that. And with this greater ability to coordinate within the army, within the military, there should also be a realization that you now have the ability to have a greater coordination across societies. And that phase 00 is really a phase of continuous contest between your ambitions or your objectives and those of your potential adversaries. And most of this will be in non-military levers of power. So we talk about whole of government. Well, phase 00 is where other government agencies largely play, with some support from defense. But to make this work, there has to be a national strategy. The United States doesn't have one. Australia doesn't have one. But if we're going to make sense of the future challenges and the ability to project power, or we could say project influence, which is really what we're after, then that might be more effective if it's other government agencies, such as forestry, fisheries, conducting tasks lined up with a national strategy to achieve influence in, use the Australian context, across nations in our region. But the point here is that you have to avoid escalation into phase 0 and then further down towards phase 3. Now this requires a degree of subtlety, but it's been done before. The U.S. used to do very similar things to like this, in Chile, when they overthrow regimes there. CIA used to do things like involved in this space. Now, I'm not saying that we should emulate that, but we should certainly start to look at ways to achieve our political objectives and achieve our influence without risking war with peer competitors. Now, this has particular relevance, I think, for Australia, because the trends that the United States is trying to counter also exist for Australia. So Australia lost the demographic battle ages ago against potential adversaries in our region. Actually, it was never much of a battle. Our population has always been much smaller than everybody else in the region. Even if we were to quadruple the Australian population to 90 to 100 million, it would still be minuscule compared to other nations in the area. So demography has never been our answer. In the past, we relied upon better technology and also more wealth. But those are technology is fading very quickly. Our edges in that area. And our ability to generate wealth as these other countries in our area break through and become modern states, any monetary wealth advantage we're also losing. So where does Australia gain an advantage? So that in case we go to war or we possibly have the threat of war, where do we gain an advantage that could be to our favor against potential adversaries? And that's why I'm suggesting phase 00, because we have an educated population, we have a cohesive population. These play to things that are our strengths. And we can achieve influence through things like military diplomacy for the military, but also by helping other nation states in our region to prosper as they modernize. So it might seem a bit odd to speak to somebody who works for the Army and is a military historian, to look at military in battle and say, yes, let's get on board this, and instead to find problems in it, and suggest that there are non-kinetic ways of achieving our goals. But that's only because I'm saying this, because we need to find the most efficient and effective ways of achieving our political objectives. And war is one of our levers of government policy, but there are also other ones. And in an age of increasing threat, and in an age of where peers are becoming more our equal, then going down the kinetic option may lead to very poor outcomes. Thank you for your time, and I'll take your questions.